She had read his letters 100 times. She had traced his handwriting with her fingertips in the dark. She had memorized the way he described a sunset over open land, the way he wrote about loneliness without a drop of self-pity, the way his words made her feel, for the first time in 26 years, that someone in this world actually understood her. And then the train stopped, and she saw him standing there on that platform, and every single thing she thought she knew collapsed like wet paper in her hands. This is the story of a woman who almost destroyed the best thing that ever happened to her, because she trusted her eyes more than her heart. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The last letter arrived on a Tuesday. Evelyn Mercer read it, standing at the kitchen window of her father's house in Philadelphia, still wearing her coat from the walk back from the post office, the November cold still clinging to the wool. She didn't sit down. She didn't make tea. She just stood there with the single folded page open in both hands and read it twice, then a third time, her breath fogging slightly in the drafty kitchen. "I will not pretend that the land out here is gentle," Gideon Hale had written. It isn't. It tests you in ways that city life never does, and not always in ways you expect. But there is something honest about a place that shows you exactly what it is. No performance, no pretense. I have come to appreciate honesty above almost everything else. I hope that does not frighten you. It didn't frighten her. That was the trouble. It did the opposite. Evelyn folded the letter back into its envelope, slipped it into the box beneath her bed, alongside the other 41 letters she had received over the past 8 months, and sat down on the edge of her mattress with her coat still on, staring at the wall. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a merchant who had made a modest fortune and then lost most of it in bad investments before she was 15. She had grown up in comfort and then learned, slowly and without ceremony, how to live without it. She had educated herself through the public library because her father could no longer afford the private academy. She had taught herself bookkeeping to help manage what remained of his business. She had watched 3 of her childhood friends marry men who spoke beautifully at dinner tables and turned into something else entirely behind closed doors. When her father's old business associate, a man named Caldwell, who had resettled in Wyoming territory, sent word that a rancher in his county was seeking a correspondence wife, Evelyn had almost thrown the letter away. She was not desperate. She told herself that clearly and without apology. She was practical. She had written back to Caldwell because she had read enough to know that the frontier was expanding, that land out west held opportunities that a crowded eastern city could not, and that a woman with her skills, accounting, organization, clear thinking, might actually be useful on a working ranch rather than simply ornamental, which was all Philadelphia seemed to want from her. She had not expected Gideon Hale's first letter to be what it was. She had expected something clumsy, something transactional. A man listing his acreage and his cattle count, and his expectations for a wife like items on a supply order. Instead, his first letter had asked her a question. What do you want your life to look like in 10 years? Not what did she cook? Not how old was she? Not was she healthy and capable of bearing children? What do you want your life to look like? She had answered honestly, half expecting him to stop writing after that. She told him she wanted to be useful, that she wanted work that actually mattered, that she was tired of being considered a problem to be solved, a daughter to be married off, rather than a person with a functioning brain. He had written back within 2 weeks. That sounds exactly right to me. 8 months later, 42 letters later, a great deal of honest conversation on paper, and one formal proposal that had made her cry in a way she was not prepared for. Here she was, sitting on the edge of her bed with her coat on, having just accepted. The wedding, such as it was, happened by proxy in December. Evelyn signed documents in a Philadelphia law office. Gideon Hale signed the same documents on the same day in a county courthouse in Harlan, Wyoming, witnessed by 2 ranch hands who apparently argued about whether to remove their hats for the occasion. She learned that detail from his letter. Doyle kept his on. He said it was too cold to take it off and that you probably wouldn't care. I told him he was likely right. I hope he was. She smiled at that letter for the rest of the afternoon. Her father shook her hand at the train station. Not unkindly. That was simply how he expressed things. Her cousin Margaret wept dramatically and promised to write every week, a promise she would keep for exactly 3 letters before life absorbed her again. The porter loaded her 2 trunks and her small traveling case, and Evelyn stood on the platform in her good gray coat and watched Philadelphia disappear as the train pulled west. She was not frightened. She told herself that. She was not frightened. She was terrified. 4 days on a train teaches you things about yourself that ordinary life keeps hidden. By the end of the first day, Evelyn had finished the 2 novels she brought and started rationing the third. By the second day, she had exhausted small talk with the woman across from her, a cheerful grandmother traveling to see a new grandchild, and spent most of the afternoon watching the landscape change through the window. By the third day, the landscape had changed so dramatically that she simply stared. She had never seen space like that. Philadelphia was a city of edges. Buildings pressed close, streets cut the sky into narrow strips. Even the parks had borders, iron fences, defined limits. But out here, past the Missouri River and into the open territories, the land simply continued in every direction, without apology. Brown grass and gray sky and the occasional dark line of a tree break along a frozen creek, and nothing else for miles and miles and miles. She understood, sitting in that train car with her breath on the glass, why Gideon had written what he wrote. There is something honest about a place that shows you exactly what it is. Yes, she saw that now. The land did not bother pretending to be something welcoming or pleasant. It was vast and cold and indifferent, and somehow that was clarifying. She pulled out his most recent letter and read it again, not for the first time on this journey. He was 34, 8 years her senior. He had come west from Ohio at 19 with his uncle and stayed when his uncle returned east. He had built the ranch largely by himself over 15 years, not inherited it, not bought it with family money, but built it, fence post by fence post, season by season. He had been engaged once before, he told her in one of the earlier letters, with a directness she found startling. The woman had come out to see the ranch and left 3 days later. He did not blame her. The frontier life was not for everyone, and better to know that early than late. I should tell you, he had written, that I am not much to look at. I say this not because I am fishing for contradiction, but because I think you should know what you are agreeing to. I am a working man and I look like one. If that is a difficulty, it is better that you know now. Evelyn had actually laughed at that letter when she first read it. She appreciated the honesty. She wrote back that she was not marrying a painting. Sitting on the train watching Wyoming approach through the window, she thought about that letter. She thought about it more than she expected to. I am not much to look at. She told herself it didn't matter. She believed herself when she said it. The train station at Harlan, Wyoming was not a station so much as a platform. A long wooden structure beside the tracks, wind-blasted and gray, with a small enclosed waiting room at one end that someone had made a half-hearted attempt to heat with an iron stove. The town itself, if it could be called that, was visible a quarter-mile distant, a scattering of low buildings along a main street that the wind was doing its best to disassemble. Evelyn stepped off the train into cold that was different from Philadelphia cold. Philadelphia cold was damp and heavy. This cold was dry and absolute, like stepping into a room where someone had removed all the warmth and forgotten to replace it. She pulled her coat tighter and looked for him. There were perhaps a dozen people on the platform, a family reuniting, a lot of embracing and noise, 2 men in conversation near the freight car, a woman waiting with a child on her hip, and then, at the far end of the platform, leaning against the post with his hat pulled low, a man. She knew immediately. Some instinct she couldn't have explained. She walked toward him, her traveling case in hand, and as she got closer, the details assembled themselves, and she felt something in her chest quietly collapse. He was large, not in a threatening way, but in the way of a man who had spent 15 years doing hard physical labor. His coat was heavy canvas, stained in places. With a torn elbow she could see even from 10 feet away. His boots were muddy, not dusty. Muddy, as if he had ridden through something wet to get here. His beard was not trimmed. It was not untrimmed in a fashionable way either. It was simply the beard of a man who did not think much about his beard. His hat was battered at the brim. He pushed off the post when he saw her and straightened up, and she saw his face clearly for the first time. He wasn't ugly. She would catalog that fairly later when she was being honest with herself. His features were regular enough, but there was nothing of the polished, quiet confidence she had built in her imagination. His face was weathered and creased, tanned the specific dark brown of a man who worked outside in all seasons. and he had a small scar along his jaw that she would eventually learn came from a fence wire incident in his early 20s. He looked, in short, nothing at all like the man she had built from 42 letters. "Mrs. Hale," he said. His voice was lower than she expected, measured. "Mr. Hale," she said. They stood looking at each other on that frozen platform for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "Train on time?" he asked. "Near enough." "Good." He reached for her larger trunk. "Wagon's out front. It's about 2 hours to the ranch. We should move before the light drops." That was it. No flourish. No attempt to impress her. He just picked up her trunk like it weighed nothing and walked toward the front of the station. Evelyn stood on the platform for exactly 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, a voice in her head, the same voice that had kept her fed and practical through her father's financial collapse, the same voice that ran the numbers and drew the conclusions, said something she would be ashamed of later. This was a mistake. Then she picked up her traveling case and followed him. The wagon was old but solid, pulled by 2 horses that Gideon handled with an ease that suggested long familiarity. He loaded her trunks in the back with economical efficiency and helped her up to the bench seat with a hand that was rough and dry from cold and work. He did not make conversation immediately. He got the horses moving and watched the road, and seemed perfectly comfortable with silence in a way that Evelyn, whose mind was running at considerable speed, found almost unsettling. The road out of Harlan moved west and then northwest, climbing gradually into territory that got emptier the farther they went. The sky was the color of pewter and sat low over the land. After perhaps 15 minutes, Evelyn could not sustain the silence anymore. "How long have you been running the ranch?" she asked. 15 years, give or take. He kept his eyes on the road. Started with about 60 head and a broke-down barn. Up to 320 now. That's significant growth. He glanced at her sideways. "You know cattle numbers?" "I know business numbers," she said. 320 head at current market prices. She had done her research before leaving Philadelphia. "That's a reasonable operation, not large, but viable." A pause. Viable. He seemed to consider the word. "Sure. Do you have trouble with cash flow between seasons?" Another sideways look, longer this time. "Most ranchers do," he said. "I noticed in your letters that you mentioned selling stock in October and again in the spring. That's a significant gap in revenue. How do you manage operating costs in the winter months?" Gideon Hale was quiet for a moment. "We're not quite to the ranch yet," he said. "You planning to audit me on the road?" She felt her face go warm. "I apologize. That was—" "No," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't irritation exactly, almost the opposite. "No, it's a fair question. The answer is, I sell some timber rights in December and I have a standing arrangement with 2 neighboring ranches to share the cost of a farrier. It's not elegant. But it works." So far. Evelyn sat with that for a moment, looked out at the landscape. The land here had a kind of severity that was different from anything she had seen from the train window, more immediate. The wind moved through the brown grass in long waves, and a hawk turned lazy circles above a distant ridge. "That hawk," she said before she could stop herself. "What kind is it?" She felt him look at her again. "Ferruginous, big one. Female, most likely, given the size." "They're larger?" "Females are larger than males in most raptors." He looked back at the road. "Evolutionary advantage. They need to be strong enough to take bigger prey while the male is away from the nest." Evelyn turned to look at him. He said it so simply, not showing off, not performing the kind of casual knowledge dropping she had seen men do at Philadelphia dinner parties. Just said it. The way you say something, you simply know. "You didn't mention birds in your letters," she said. "You didn't ask about birds." "What else didn't I ask about?" He thought for a moment. The horse's hooves on the frozen road made a rhythmic sound. "Geology," he said finally. "Wolves. We've got a pack that's been moving through the North Pasture. Indigenous land history. I can tell you things about this valley that go back further than any written record. Plant medicine. The Arapaho woman who lived 2 miles east of here before the territory changed taught me more about what grows on this land and what it does than any book would." He said it without any note of pride. Just listing things, the way you'd list tools in a shed. Evelyn stared at him. You know, she said slowly, I expected. I know what you expected, he said, not unkindly, flat, honest. I could see it when you got off the train. The silence that followed was of a different quality than before. She felt heat in her face that wasn't from cold. I'm sorry, she said. Nothing to apologize for yet, he said. You saw a man on a platform. You don't know me. You don't know me. He said it without rancor, like he was simply stating a condition that could be changed if there was enough patience and time. Evelyn looked at her hands in her lap. She was not a woman who was easily unsettled, but she felt, in a way she didn't entirely understand, that she was losing an argument with herself. He started talking about a mile outside of town, not about himself, about the land. She could never entirely explain afterward why it affected her as much as it did. She had met educated men. She had met articulate men. She had sat through dinner parties in Philadelphia where men held forth at great length about topics of their choosing while women listened with expressions of careful interest. This was different. Gideon Hale didn't hold forth. He simply described. When they crossed a dry creek bed, he told her that it ran 3 feet deep in spring from snowmelt and that the cottonwoods lining it were probably 200 years old based on their trunk diameter, and that the ones with the bark, stripped at a particular height, were marked by elk rubbing their antlers in autumn. When the road climbed a small rise and the valley spread out below them, he mentioned that the particular coloring of the far hills, a dark reddish-brown, indicated iron-rich rock underneath, and that the early homesteaders had tried to mine it in the 1850s before realizing the deposit wasn't commercially viable. How do you know the homesteader history? She asked. Library in Harlan has territorial records going back to 1848. I've read most of them. He guided the horses around a frozen rut. Winter gives you time. You read in the winter. I read when I can. Winter, mostly. He paused. That's how I ended up corresponding with Caldwell. I wrote him a letter about a land dispute that affected the northeast corner of my property, and he wrote back. Over time, we kept writing about other things. And he told you to... She stopped. He told me there was a woman in Philadelphia with a good mind who was wasting it on a city that didn't deserve her, Gideon said. His words. Evelyn was quiet. Are you saying he recruited me? I'm saying he thought you might be interested. He looked at her again, and there was something in that direct gaze she was still getting used to. You were free to say no. I said yes. You did. To your letters, she said, a dangerous clarity in her voice. I should be honest about that. I said yes to the man I came to know through your letters. He didn't flinch. And that man isn't what you saw on the platform. She searched for words that were honest without being cruel. I didn't see your letters in your face. No, he said simply. You wouldn't. Letters are words. Faces are just faces. He looked at the road. I meant what I wrote, every word, whether you believe that is up to you. The honesty of it was almost confrontational. She had expected, she realized, some kind of salesmanship, some attempt to charm her into believing this was fine. He was what she expected. Everything would be wonderful. Instead, he was just laying out the facts. Here is the situation. Here is what is true. Make of it what you will. She found it deeply unsettling. She also found it, if she was going to be honest with herself, deeply compelling. The ranch appeared around a bend in the road as the sun dropped toward the western hills, throwing long shadows across the land. It was not what she expected. She had imagined something rougher, more temporary. The frontier settlements she had read about in newspapers were described in terms that made them sound provisional, as if everyone was waiting to see if the whole enterprise would take before committing fully. The Hale Ranch was committed. The main house was built of timber and stone, 2 stories, solid-looking, with smoke rising from 2 chimneys. There was a barn larger than the house. A separate structure she would later learn was a bunkhouse for the 2 hands, a root cellar mounted with earth for insulation, a woodshed stacked to its roof with split timber, and a series of fenced pastures extending north toward a tree line. It looked like a place that had decided to stay. 2 men appeared from the barn as the wagon pulled in. Younger than Gideon, one of them barely out of adolescence by the look of him. That's Doyle and his younger cousin Pete, Gideon said. Doyle's been with me 7 years, Pete since last spring. Doyle was a lean, weather-seamed man of perhaps 30, with a mustache he was clearly proud of. He pulled off his hat. Evelyn noticed this, given the story from the letter, and gave her a nod that was awkward but sincere. "Ma'am, welcome." Pete, who was perhaps 19 and had the expression of someone who was never entirely sure what was happening, just stared at her with open curiosity until Doyle elbowed him. "Ma'am," Pete managed. "Gentlemen," Evelyn said. Gideon carried her trunks inside without ceremony. She followed him through the front door and stopped. The inside of the house was not what she expected either. It was clean. Genuinely clean. Not clean for a bachelor who knew company was coming, but actually maintained. The floors were swept, the windows washed. There was a sitting room with a stone fireplace already laid with wood, a kitchen she could see through a doorway with a serious iron stove, and bookshelves. 2 of them, on either side of the fireplace, floor to ceiling, filled with books that had clearly been read rather than displayed. She walked to the nearest shelf before she could stop herself. History, natural science, veterinary medicine, surveying, agricultural texts, several volumes on the Plains peoples, 3 on geology, and interspersed among the practical, like Hidden Things, Dickens, Thoreau, a complete set of Shakespeare with the spine cracked from heavy use, a worn copy of George Eliot's Middlemarch with penciled notes in the margins. She pulled out the Middlemarch and looked at it. "You've read this," she said. Not a question. "Twice." He was setting her trunk at the foot of the stairs. "I disagree with her about Casaubon. He's pathetic, but I don't think he's villainous. She could have been clearer on that." Evelyn put the book back. She was having trouble, she realized, keeping her face composed. "Your room's upstairs," he said. "Second on the left. I'll sleep in the room across the hall. You'll have your privacy. I know there's no use pretending it isn't a strange situation. We'll figure out the rest as we go." He said it matter-of-factly. No discomfort, no elaborate reassurance, just the plain statement of the arrangement. "That's fair," she said, matching his tone. He nodded, turned toward the kitchen. "Supper's in an hour. It's not impressive cooking, but it's hot." He was right that the cooking was not impressive. The stew was serviceable, tough beef that had been simmering long enough to stop being difficult, root vegetables she couldn't entirely identify, bread that was clearly not the first loaf he'd baked, but not his 20th either. He set it on the table without apology, and they sat across from each other, and the first supper of their marriage began. She was aware of how strange it was. The 2 of them at opposite ends of a wooden table in a ranch house on the Wyoming frontier in the first week of December, legally married and entirely unfamiliar. The fire going in the kitchen stove, the wind audible outside, pushing at the walls, Doyle and Pete eating in the bunkhouse. "The stew is fine," she said, because the silence had gone on long enough. "The carrots got soft," he said. "I left it too long." "I've had worse." "You're being polite." "I'm being accurate." She broke a piece of bread. "It's edible and it's hot. That's the standard I'm working with at the moment." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, but the approach to one. "What's the actual standard?" he asked. "My mother's pot roast was the actual standard. She died when I was 12, and I haven't reached it since in anything I've eaten." "What made it good?" She looked up. "That's an unusual question." "You brought it up." She thought about it. She used red wine, and something she called a bouquet garni, which she learned from a French cookbook, and she'd let it cook on the lowest possible heat for hours. The whole house smelled different on pot roast days. Gideon nodded slowly. What did the house smell like? Like something good was happening. She heard herself and looked down at her stew. "That sounds like nonsense." "No, it doesn't," he said. "That's exactly what good cooking smells like." She looked at him across the table. He was eating steadily, unbothered, the way he did most things, but she noticed his eyes. In the lamplight, they were a particular shade of gray-green she hadn't registered on the platform, and they missed nothing. She had the continuous, slightly uncomfortable feeling of being observed accurately. "You're nothing like I expected," she said. He looked up. "Is that good or bad?" he asked. "I genuinely don't know yet," she said honestly. He considered this. "That's a fair answer." "Do you—" She stopped, started again. When you wrote to me, all those months, did you have an expectation of what I'd be like? I had an impression, he said carefully, from your letters, the way you thought, the way you described things, the questions you asked. And? And you're exactly what I expected, he said. It landed differently than she would have anticipated. She wasn't sure what she felt about it. What does that mean? It means your letters were honest, he said. Same as mine. That's not nothing. They ate in silence for a moment, and the silence was a different kind than before. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile. Something in between that didn't have a name yet. I can help with the books, she said. The ranch finances. If you'd let me look at them. I noticed you said your system wasn't elegant. My system is a box and a prayer, he said flatly. She looked at him. Box? She said. Box, he confirmed. Everything goes in the box. At the end of the year, Doyle adds it up and tells me if we survived. That's... She stopped herself from saying what she actually thought. That's one approach. It's a terrible approach, he said, apparently unbothered. I know it's a terrible approach. Numbers aren't... They're not how I think. If you can do better, I'll hand you the box tomorrow and never touch it again, and I'll sleep better for it. Evelyn set down her spoon. You do that? She said. Simply hand the finances of your ranch to someone you met 6 hours ago? He met her eyes. I've known you 8 months, he said. 6 hours is just the face. She went up early. She told him she was tired from the journey, which was true enough, and he said of course and showed her the lamp and made sure she knew where the extra blankets were in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. The room was small but clean. The bed had a quilt on it that was worn at the edges and clearly old. She would eventually learn he had brought it from Ohio, that it had been his mother's, that he never mentioned this. The window looked out over the dark pasture and the tree line beyond. She sat on the edge of the bed and held herself very still for a moment. He's nothing like what I expected. That was what she'd said. She turned it over now, in the quiet. What had she expected, truly? She had expected the letters, a physical version of the letters, a man who looked like his words, which was, she understood, an absurd expectation since words had no face. She had built something in her imagination over 8 months, some portrait assembled from syntax and subject matter, and the particular way he constructed a sentence, and she had gotten off that train expecting to meet the portrait. Instead, she had met a man with mud on his boots and a torn coat and rough hands and a box full of financial records and an opinion about Casaubon in Middlemarch. She pressed the heels of her palms against her eyes. 6 hours is just the face, he had said. She lay back on the quilt without undressing and stared at the ceiling. The wind pressed against the window. The house settled around her, making the sounds old buildings make. Timber and stone adjusting to temperature, adjusting to winter's settling weight. Somewhere below she could hear him moving around the kitchen, the sound of a plate, water, the stove door. She thought about the hawk, ferruginous. Females are larger, evolutionary advantage. She thought about the bookshelves, the pencil marks in Middlemarch. She thought about the stew, which had been exactly as described. Not impressive, but hot. She thought about 6 hours is just the face. And she lay awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the frontier wind and trying to figure out what she was feeling, in a room that smelled like cedar and wood smoke and the ghost of someone else's quilt, in a house she had never been to before, next to a man she had known for 8 months and met for 6 hours, at the beginning of what appeared to be the rest of her life. She did not come to a conclusion. She simply, eventually, slept. She woke to the sound of an axe. The window was still dark. When she pressed her face to the cold glass, she could see the yard below lit by a lantern hung on a post, and in that circle of yellow light, Gideon Hale was splitting wood. He had been at it long enough that a considerable stack had formed beside him. He worked without hurry, a rhythm to it. Set the log, raised the axe, a single clean split. And the sound of each impact reached her a fraction after the motion, like a sound slightly out of sync with the world. She dressed quickly in the cold and went downstairs. The kitchen was warm. He had laid the fire before coming outside. There was a coffee pot on the stove, and she found cups in the second cupboard she tried and poured one and stood at the kitchen window watching him work. Doyle arrived from the bunkhouse eventually, and the two men exchanged a few words she couldn't hear, and then Doyle headed toward the barn, and Gideon set his axe against the chopping block and picked up the lantern and came inside. He stopped when he saw her at the window. "Didn't know you were up," he said. "I found the coffee." "Good." He hung his coat on the peg by the door and went to the stove and poured his own cup. And there was something entirely natural about it. The two of them in a kitchen in the early dark with coffee, as if this were something they had always done. "You start early," she said. "Animals need feeding, regardless of whether it's early." He wrapped both hands around the cup. "You sleep okay?" "Better than I expected." He nodded. "What's the plan for today?" she asked. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. Something in his expression shifted. That same almost smile from last night. "I told you about the box," he said. "You did. If you want to look at it today, I'll get it from the office." He used the word office loosely. She would later see it was more of a storage room with a desk in it. Fair warning, it may cause you actual pain. "I've untangled worse," she said. She thought of her father's accounts after the bad investments. The specific kind of sick feeling that came from looking at numbers that had been ignored until they became a story you didn't want to finish reading. "Bring me the box." He looked at her for a moment, not assessing exactly, more like settling something in his mind. "All right," he said. "I'll get it after chores." He finished his coffee, set down the cup, and went back out to the barn without any particular ceremony. Evelyn stood in the warm kitchen and listened to the sound of him crossing the frozen yard. She thought about the voice that had spoken to her on the platform. This was a mistake. She looked at the bookshelves through the kitchen doorway. She looked at the competently laid fire, the stocked woodshed she'd seen through the window, the clean house, the solid construction of the walls around her. She thought about the hawk and about Middlemarch with its pencil marks. This was a mistake. She wasn't sure anymore that the voice had been talking about the right thing. The box was, as advertised, a catastrophe. It was a wooden crate that had originally shipped nails, judging by the stenciling on the side, and it was filled with papers in a state of organization that could only be described as geological. The older you went, the deeper you found it. Receipts, bills of sale, tax documents, hand-tallied lists of cattle counts, notes in Gideon's small, careful handwriting, notes in Doyle's much larger and less careful handwriting, a folded land survey from 1871, and at the very bottom, a note from someone named Bertram that simply said you owe me $4 for the wire and was undated. Gideon put it on the desk in the storage room and then stood back as if he were introducing two people he was glad to be free of. "I told you," he said. "How long has it been like this?" "Since I started." He paused. "Before, I kept things in my head. When the operation got bigger than my head could hold, I got the box. And no one has ever—" She sorted through the top layer of papers. Some of them were from last year. Some were from 3 years ago. They were not filed in any way she could identify. "You've never had anyone look at this?" "Doyle looks at the totals at the end of the year." "With what method?" "He adds up what came in and takes away what went out and tells me the number." "And the number has been positive?" "So far," Gideon said. "Barely. Some years." Evelyn set down the papers and looked at him. "If you give me 2 weeks with this," she said carefully, "I can give you a complete picture of where this ranch stands financially, not just whether you survived, the actual margins, the actual patterns, where you're losing money you don't know you're losing, and where the real opportunity is." He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her in that level way. "And what do you need?" "Paper, a decent pen, a lamp that doesn't flicker, and access to you when I have questions you'll need to answer." "You have all of those things," he said. She looked at the box. "Give me the morning alone with this," she said. "I need to understand what I'm working with before I'll know anything." He pushed off the doorframe. "I'll be in the south pasture if you need me." He was at the door when she said his name. "Mr. Hale." He stopped. "Why wasn't this done before?" she asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. "You're clearly not—" She chose her words. "You're clearly not someone who avoids difficult things." He was quiet for a moment. "Numbers make sense to me in the field," he said finally. "How many head? How many acres? How many pounds of feed per week in winter? But the money part, the abstraction of it, it doesn't sit in my mind the way other things do." He paused. "I know that's a weakness." "It's not a weakness," she said. "It's a gap. Everyone has gaps." He looked at her for a moment. What's yours? He asked. She blinked. I'm not patient, she said, and I make judgments too quickly. The sentence sat in the air between them. They both knew it was more than a general self-description. Gideon Hale nodded once, without comment, and went out to the south pasture. Evelyn sat down at the desk, pulled the box toward her, and began. It took 4 days, not 2 weeks. She had given herself a conservative estimate, but the organization she'd suspected was simple chaos turned out to be something closer to selective memory. Gideon had kept records of what mattered most to him, which turned out to be a great deal, just not in any findable order. Once she understood his logic, which was intuitive rather than systematic, she could reconstruct it. By the end of the first day, she had the past 2 years sorted and categorized on paper. By the end of the second, she had gone back 4 years and begun to see patterns. By the third day, she had 5 years of clear financial history in front of her, and she started to understand what she was really looking at. She brought it to him on the evening of the fourth day. He was at the kitchen table with a surveying manual and his coffee, and he looked up when she came in with her papers and set them in front of him. You can read numbers, she said. It's the system that was failing you. This is a profitable ranch. He looked at the papers and then at her. Barely profitable, he said. Barely, consistently, for 15 years, she said. That's not barely. That's resilient. She pointed to a column. You're losing money here every single year. The timber sale prices. You're selling below value because you're selling quickly, before peak market. If you hold 2 months longer, your average return improves by approximately 18%. He leaned forward over the papers. And here, she continued, your feed costs in January are dramatically higher than your neighboring ranches, based on what you mentioned in our letters. I don't have their exact numbers, but the proportion is off. Either you're paying above market prices, or your supplier is aware you have no alternative. Billings, he said slowly. My feed supplier. He's the only one within 30 miles. Is he the only one within 40? A pause. No. Then he knows that too, she said. This is costing you $300 annually, conservatively. Gideon sat back and looked at the papers. The lines in his face did something she hadn't seen before, a kind of recalibration. 300, he said. That's a conservative estimate, she said. The real number might be higher. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, what else? She went through it with him for 2 hours. He asked careful questions and listened to the answers with his full attention and never once made her feel like she was explaining things he should have known. He took notes in the margin of her papers in his small handwriting. When they were done, he sat back and looked at everything laid out on the table and was quiet for a long moment. I've been running this ranch blind, he said finally. Not angrily, just factually. You've been running it on instinct and it's worked, she said. Imagine what it does when you can also see. He looked up at her. She hadn't planned to say it quite like that. It was more generous than she usually allowed herself to be with someone she was still figuring out. His expression did something complicated. Evelyn, he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. This is... He looked at the papers. This is the most useful thing anyone has ever done for this ranch. It's only numbers, she said. No, he said quietly. It's not. She gathered her papers and said she was going to bed. She was at the kitchen door when he said, I disagree with you about what a weakness is. She stopped. You said not being patient is a weakness, he said. I don't think it is. I think not being patient and knowing you're not patient is different from not being patient and not knowing it. She stood in the doorway. And the judgment too quickly thing, he said. Same. You know you do it. She didn't turn around. Good night, Mr. Hale, she said. Good night, Evelyn. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the quilt and put her face in her hands, not from distress exactly, but from the peculiar disorientation of feeling more seen than she was accustomed to. Outside, the Wyoming wind pushed at the walls, and the winter, with everything it would bring, was just beginning. The snow came in the second week of December and didn't leave. It arrived not with drama, but with a kind of quiet determination, the way serious things often do. A gray sky that got lower through the afternoon, then a few dry flakes that could have been dust. Then by evening, a steady fall that covered the yard by morning and kept coming. Gideon looked at it from the kitchen window while his coffee cooled and said nothing, which Evelyn was learning meant it was neither surprising nor good. Is this normal? She asked. For December, yes. He picked up his cup. This particular amount, maybe a little early. Does it affect the cattle? Everything affects the cattle. He said it without complaint, just as a statement of ranching truth. We moved them to the south pasture last week when I saw this coming. Closer to the shelter and the supplemental feed. They'll be fine as long as it doesn't get worse than this for too long. And if it does? He looked at her. Then it gets harder. She absorbed that. She was learning that Gideon measured difficulty on a scale calibrated entirely differently from anything she'd grown up with. What he called harder, she suspected, would have stopped most men she'd known from the East entirely. The first weeks of marriage were strange in ways she hadn't anticipated and ordinary in ways she hadn't expected either. The strangeness was the constant proximity to someone she was still constructing an understanding of, the way you had to navigate around another person's habits and rhythms and moods without yet knowing which ones were permanent and which were temporary. The ordinariness was everything else. The meals, the work, the evenings, the structure that a working ranch imposed on a day whether you wanted structure or not. She had the finances in order within 2 weeks, as promised. She built a proper ledger system from blank accounting books she asked Gideon to order from Harlan, organized by category and month, with a separate sheet for projections. She showed him how to read it and, more importantly, what to look for. And when she handed him the completed first month's entry, he held it like something that might be fragile. You can write in it, she said. It's just paper. I know it's just paper. He set it carefully on the desk. I've been running this place for 15 years without anything that looked like this. Was that frustrating? He thought about it. I didn't know what I was missing, he said. So no, but now that I can see it clearly, he looked at the ledger. Yeah, a little. She discovered in those early weeks that living with Gideon Hale was nothing like what she had read about frontier marriages, which the Eastern newspapers tended to describe in terms of female sacrifice and male authority. Gideon did not seem to have read those newspapers, or if he had, he'd dismissed them entirely. He did not make decisions about the house and then inform her of them. He asked, not in a performative way, not to seem progressive, just practically, because she lived there and therefore her opinion was relevant data. When he decided to order supplies from Harlan before the next heavy snow, he came to find her in the office and said, "Anything you need from town before the road gets bad?" Not as an afterthought. First, when Pete made a mistake that cost them half a day's work, Gideon handled it quietly, outside, and afterward told Evelyn about it in a way that wasn't seeking her endorsement, just keeping her informed about what was happening on the ranch, as if she had a right to know, as if it were her ranch too. It was her ranch too. She was still getting used to that. The thing she found herself most unprepared for was his silences. Not uncomfortable silences. She had experienced enough of those in her life to recognize them. His silences were something else. He could sit across from her at the kitchen table in the evening, both of them reading, the fire going in the stove, and say nothing for 2 hours, and somehow it wasn't absence. It was just, he was there, and she was there, and the room was warm, and that was sufficient. She had never known anyone who was sufficient without talking. One evening in mid-December, she looked up from her book and found him watching her with the expression she still had trouble reading. Not quite a smile, but something in that neighborhood. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked back at his book. "You were looking at me." "I was." No apology, no embarrassment. "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "You make a face when you're reading something you disagree with," he said. "Left side of your mouth goes tight. You've done it 4 times since we sat down." She stared at him. "You've been watching me disagree with a book for 2 hours?" "On and off." He turned a page. "What are you reading?" "An essay about frontier women," she said. "It's condescending." It implies that women who came west were either fleeing something or following someone, and that their inner lives were essentially reactive. As if we had no independent... She stopped. "You're smiling." "I'm not smiling." "Your eyes are smiling." "That's a thing you invented." "It's a thing your face is doing," she said. "Don't do that. Don't find me amusing when I'm making a serious point." "I'm not finding you amusing," he said. "I'm finding you..." He seemed to consider the word. "Consistent." What does that mean? It means you're the same person you were in your letters. He closed his book on his thumb. That essay is wrong, by the way. I know 3 women within 20 miles of this ranch who came west entirely on their own terms and would take serious exception to that description. She looked at him. Will you introduce me to them? She said. If you'd like. She would, she said. And she meant it, and he registered that. And something small but real shifted between them in that moment. Not a declaration, not a threshold crossed, just a stitch. One of many that were quietly accumulating. The first time she saw him with an injured animal, she understood something about him that all the letters in the world hadn't communicated. One of the horses, a bay mare called Nell, had caught her leg on a fence wire, and the wound was bad enough that Doyle came to get Gideon from supper. Evelyn followed without being invited, partly from genuine concern, and partly because she was trying to build a complete picture of this place and this man, and standing in the warm kitchen while something was happening felt wrong. The barn was cold and smelled of hay and manure and horse and lantern oil. Nell was agitated, her weight shifting, whites of her eyes showing. Gideon went to her the way you go to something you've known a long time, without hesitation, without theater, just directly. He put his hand on her neck and spoke to her in a voice so low Evelyn couldn't catch the words, only the register of them, and Nell's head dropped by increments. He cleaned the wound and treated it with calm efficiency, and the whole time he kept that low, one-sided conversation going, not reassuring nonsense, but something more specific, more real. She couldn't hear it. She watched his hands instead, the same hands that split wood and repaired fences, moving with a gentleness that was not delicacy, but something more considered than that. She'll be fine, he said afterward, without looking up from wrapping the leg. Wire cut's clean. She'll favor it a week, maybe 10 days. You knew exactly what to do, Evelyn said. I've done it before. He tied off the wrap. Lost a horse to a wound like this 8 years ago because I didn't know what I was doing. You learn. He said it without self-pity, as a plain statement of how knowledge was acquired in a place like this, through what went wrong, through what it cost you. She thought about that on the walk back to the house. She thought about what it meant to build competence entirely from your own mistakes on a frontier where mistakes sometimes cost you an animal or a season or something worse. Gideon, she said. He looked at her. I owe you an apology, she said, a real one. They were halfway between the barn and the house, in the dark and the cold, snow crunching under their feet. For what? He said. He wasn't performing ignorance. He actually seemed to want to know which thing she meant. The platform, she said, when I arrived. I made a judgment about you that I shouldn't have made, and I made it in about 30 seconds, and I held on to it past the point where I had any evidence to support it. She kept her voice even. That was wrong, and I'm sorry. He was quiet for a few steps. You don't have to apologize for a first impression, he said. I do if I acted on it. Did you? I was going to leave, she said. It was the first time she'd said it aloud. In those first days, I was looking at my options. I had a small amount of money, and I was thinking about what I could do with it if I... She stopped. I was looking for the exit. The wind pushed between them. Gideon stopped walking. She stopped too and looked at him. His face in the dark was difficult to read, but she could see that he'd gone still in the way he went still when something required his full consideration. But you didn't leave, he said. No. What changed? She thought about it honestly. You, she said. The way you talked about the land on the wagon road, the bookshelves, the way you handed me the box and never for a single moment made me feel like I was being tested or patronized. She looked at the house, the light in the kitchen window. You just treated me like someone who could be useful, like that was obvious. It was obvious, he said. It isn't to most people. He looked at the house too. Well, he said finally, I'm glad you didn't leave. She could hear that he meant it plainly, without weight or manipulation, just as a fact. He was glad. Here's the fact, stated. She found that particular quality in him, the plainness of his genuine feelings, the way he didn't bury them in performance, one of the most disorienting things about him. She wasn't used to it. So am I, she said. They went inside. He put more wood on the fire and she made tea that was better than his, and they sat in the sitting room without talking for an hour, which was by then beginning to feel like its own kind of conversation. Christmas came and went quietly. He had not expected her to do anything for it, and she found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to. She made a proper roast from a recipe she reconstructed from memory. Not her mother's pot roast, but something decent. And she found a small spruce branch and put it in a jar on the table, which Pete found inexplicably moving, and Doyle teased him about for 3 days. Gideon gave her a book. He left it on the kitchen table without ceremony or wrapping, and when she came down in the morning, it was just sitting there. A new copy of a scientific survey of Wyoming's geology, published that year, with precise illustrations of rock formations and topographical maps so detailed she sat down immediately and was still reading an hour later when he came in from morning chores. "I thought," he said, pouring coffee, "since you've been looking at the land and asking questions." "This is wonderful," she said. She didn't look up from the page. "Okay," he said, and that was that. She had bought him pen nibs and a bottle of good ink from a catalog she'd found among his papers, practical things, because she'd noticed him writing with a nib so worn it scratched the paper. He held them for a moment and said, "These are good," and she understood that was what he had instead of effusion, and that it was sufficient. January was when the real cold arrived. The temperature dropped in the first week and kept dropping, and the wind came down from the north with a meanness that made December seem agreeable. Gideon added 2 hours to his daily work, checking the cattle shelter, breaking ice on the water troughs, maintaining the fences against wind damage. He came in for meals and went back out and came in at dark, and sometimes went back out again if something needed watching. He did it without complaint, without drama, with the same steady endurance he seemed to bring to everything. Evelyn watched this and felt something she struggled to categorize. It wasn't admiration exactly, or it wasn't only that, it was more like recognition. She had grown up watching her father struggle and diminish and ultimately fail to hold his world together, and she had spent a long time afterward in the presence of men who presented competence as a performance rather than a practice. Gideon Hale's competence was entirely internal. It did not need an audience. He would have done every single bit of it the same way if she weren't there watching. She started helping with the indoor work more systematically. She reorganized the root cellar inventory so they had a clear picture of what provisions remained, which turned out to matter when the road to Harlan became impassable for 10 days in late January. She learned to maintain the stove properly, which she had not known before arriving, and which Gideon taught her without condescension, simply by showing her once and being available for questions. She took over the tracking of feed consumption so Gideon could see in real time how quickly they were going through winter stores. At this rate, she told him one evening, showing him the numbers, "You'll want to start supplementing with the second hay store no later than February 8th. If you wait past the 10th, you'll be cutting it close by March." He looked at the numbers. "February 8th, he said. "Give yourself 2 days of margin in case the weather doesn't cooperate." "February 6th, he said. "February 6th, she agreed. He switched to the second hay store on February 6th. She marked it in the ledger and felt a satisfaction that was small and specific and entirely real. She was, she realized, making herself indispensable. Not from calculation. She had started doing it before she was conscious of the decision. She was doing it because the problems were in front of her. And she could see solutions, and it seemed absurd not to apply them. That was all. That was everything. But there was a night in late January when the cold was particularly bad, and they were both sitting closer to the stove than usual, that she looked up and found Gideon looking at her with that expression she'd learned but still hadn't entirely decoded, and she said, "What?" the same way she always did, and he said nothing, the same way he always did, but this time he added quietly, "I'm just glad you're here." Not as a declaration, not with weight, just a fact, the way he stated most true things, set it down and left it there. She didn't say anything back. Not immediately. After a moment, she said, "Tell me about the wolves, the pack you mentioned on the wagon road." He told her about the wolves for an hour, and she listened, and the stove clicked and settled, and outside the Wyoming winter pressed itself against the walls of a house that held, stubbornly, against everything it sent. She was still figuring out what she felt, but she was no longer looking for the exit. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, quite a lot. The argument happened on a Tuesday in February, which was the kind of specific detail that lodged itself permanently in memory because of what came after it. It started over something practical, the way the real arguments always did. Evelyn had been reviewing the winter feed projections again and discovered a discrepancy. A section of the north fence line that Gideon had mentioned needed inspection before spring, which, if it had failed, would mean cattle drifting into territory where the supplemental feed didn't reach. She had done the math on what a drift of 20 or 30 head in this temperature would cost them, and the number was significant. She raised it at supper. "The north fence," she said. "When did you last check it?" Gideon looked up from his plate. "November. Before the heavy snow. That's 3 months. That's normal," he said. "You don't ride fence line in deep winter. The ground's frozen. You can't make repairs even if you find damage, and the risk to the rider isn't worth it. But if there's damage and cattle drift, Evelyn," his voice was patient but with an edge she hadn't heard before, "I know this land. I know what those fences can take." She set down her fork. "You also told me in October that the northeast section was already showing wear. And I told you it would hold until spring. You told me you thought it would hold." The distinction sat between them. Gideon put his hands on the table. "There is a difference," he said carefully, "between managing a ledger and managing a working ranch in February. The numbers don't account for what 15 years out here teaches you about risk." "No," she said, matching his care exactly. "But 15 years of intuition doesn't account for what the numbers show about consequence. They're not competing. They're supposed to work together." He was quiet. "That northeast section," she said. "What's the creek situation out there?" A pause. "Millhaven Creek runs along the eastern boundary." "How does it freeze?" Another pause, longer. She could see him working through something. "Shallow," he said finally. "Fast-moving in the center. It doesn't freeze solid through. There are weak spots. And cattle near a partially frozen creek in these temperatures." He said nothing. "I'm not questioning your knowledge of this land," she said. "I'm saying the two things together, the northeast fence wear and the creek, make that section a specific risk that might be worth a single inspection ride on a clear day." Gideon sat back. He looked at the wall for a moment, the way he did when he was running calculations of his own that had nothing to do with numbers. "The weather's supposed to break Thursday," he said. "I'll ride out Thursday." "I could go with you." "No," he said, and there was a flatness to it that surprised her. "It's a hard ride in these conditions. 5 miles out, difficult terrain. You haven't been on a horse since you arrived." She bristled. "I've been riding since I was 8. "In a Philadelphia park," he said. Not unkindly, but precisely. "That's—" She stopped. "That's probably fair," she admitted, because it was. City riding and frontier riding were not the same discipline, and she was honest enough to acknowledge that. "But I want to learn. I need to learn if I'm going to be useful out here." He looked at her then, the gray-green eyes doing what they always did, landing on her fully, without deflection. "You are useful," he said. "You're more useful than you know, but useful doesn't mean you have to do every single thing at once." She let it rest there, not because she agreed entirely, but because she recognized there was some truth in it, and she was getting better at telling the difference between arguments worth pressing and arguments worth setting aside. Thursday came clear and cold. Gideon left before light with Doyle, and Evelyn spent the morning at her desk working through a new projection for the spring cattle sale, calculating the improved margin they could expect now that she'd renegotiated the feed supplier arrangement. Gideon had made the trip to the farther supplier in early February, and the price difference was almost exactly what she'd estimated. She was satisfied with the morning's work. That was the truth of it. She was genuinely satisfied in a way that she hadn't felt in years. The satisfaction of work that was real, that touched real consequences, that wasn't performance or obligation, but actual contribution to something that mattered. She was also, by early afternoon, restless in a way she couldn't reason away. Gideon and Doyle had been gone 6 hours. The north fence was 5 miles out. She told herself that was nothing, that men who worked this land covered 5 miles and back without difficulty. She told herself that Gideon knew what he was doing, that 15 years of experience meant something, that her concern was a product of sitting indoors and running numbers until the numbers started to feel more real than the world outside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky, which was doing something she couldn't name. Not darkening exactly, but changing quality. Pete was in the barn. She could see the barn door was open. She put on her coat and went outside. "Pete," she said. He appeared from inside carrying a bucket. "Mrs. Hale." What's the sky doing? He looked up. His expression, which usually ran toward the uncomplicated, tightened into something more serious. Changing, he said. Wind's picking up from the northwest. That's not good. How quickly? Hard to say. He set down the bucket. Could be nothing. Could be a front coming in faster than anyone said it would. He looked toward the north, the direction Gideon had ridden. Mr. Hale's been out in worse. He knows what a weather change looks like before it gets here. And if he misreads it? Pete didn't answer that. He looked at the bucket instead. She went back inside and tried to return to the ledger. She stayed with it for 40 minutes before she admitted to herself that she was not working. She was staring at numbers that were no longer resolving into meaning because something else was running loudly underneath her focus. She did not make the decision dramatically. That was what she would think about later. There was no moment of resolve, no clear choice, just a quiet inevitability, the way water moves toward the lowest point, not because it decides to, but because that's what water does. She went to the barn and saddled Gideon's second horse, a steady roan gelding named August that she had watched him use for lighter work. She knew which direction north was. She knew the creek ran along the eastern boundary. She had looked at the survey maps in her geology book more times than she'd told anyone. Pete came in while she was tightening the girth. "Mrs. Hale," he said, and there was something careful in his voice. "Mr. Hale said—" "I know what he said," she told him. "I'm going to the northeast section. The weather is changing, which is exactly why someone should know where they are." She put her foot in the stirrup and went up, and August shifted under her but didn't protest, which she took as a reasonable sign. "Tell Gideon where I went if he comes back before me." Pete stood in the barn door looking profoundly uncertain about his position in this situation. "Mrs. Hale, I'll be careful," she said, and rode north. The cold hit differently on horseback. She had known it would be colder moving, but the wind that had seemed merely present in the yard became something with intention out in the open land, cutting through her coat at the seams and around the collar. She kept her head down and let August find his footing on the frozen ground, which he did with the competence of a horse that had been doing it for years. The land north of the ranch buildings was rougher than what she could see from the windows. The flatness she'd observed from a distance turned out to conceal a series of shallow draws and frozen creek crossings and ridges that required working around rather than over. She had looked at maps. The maps had been accurate about distances and less informative about terrain. She had been riding perhaps 40 minutes when she found the fence. The northeast section was visible from a slight rise, and even from 100 yards she could see that Gideon had been right to worry. A section of maybe 30 feet had come down, the posts tilted and the wire sagging in a heap that wouldn't stop a determined animal from walking through. She rode closer and assessed the damage. Not catastrophic. The posts were still solid. The wire could be restrung, but a breach that would matter come spring if the cattle discovered it. She was noting the location mentally, preparing to turn back with her report, when the wind changed. It didn't build gradually. It shifted direction in the space of about 2 seconds, from the northwest to directly north, and the temperature dropped with it, the kind of drop that registers in the body before the mind understands what it means. The sky to the north, which had been flat gray, was now a particular shade she had no reference for, a dark color that was almost green at the edges, pressing down toward the land. She turned August's head south and urged him into a trot. He was willing, but the ground was treacherous, and he slowed at the first draw, picking his way down the slope with care she could not rush without risking his footing. The wind was serious now, not howling yet, but building in register, and it carried the first snow. Not flakes, but needles, driven horizontally, catching her in the face and eyes. She knew she was in difficulty approximately 8 minutes after the wind changed. Not panic. She registered that clearly, told herself to stay even, but real, specific difficulty. She could no longer see the rise she'd come over. The landmarks she'd been tracking were gone in the whitening air. August was slowing more, head low against the wind, and she could feel through the reins that he was uncertain, which was not a quality she wanted in her only navigation. She let him pick his own line. She had read that lost riders should give experienced horses their heads, that animals in familiar territory would return to shelter if given the choice. August moved south and slightly west, and she stayed with him, bent low over his neck to reduce the wind resistance, her hands so cold inside her gloves that she could feel each finger as a separate ache. That was when she heard the creek. She shouldn't have been near Millhaven Creek. The route she'd taken had kept her well east of it, but the wind had been pushing her, she realized, and August navigating around the terrain had drifted their line, and now she could hear open water below a shelf of ice to her left. That particular sound of moving water under cover, intimate and dangerous. "Easy," she said to August, and pulled his head right. He didn't listen. Or he heard something she didn't and moved toward it. A horse doing horse logic, in a situation where horse logic and human logic didn't align. And the ice shelf was wider than she'd understood, and August's right foreleg went through it before either of them had any warning at all. The horse lurched. She went left. The water was shockingly cold. Not cold the way anything she had experienced before was cold. Cold as an erasure. Cold as a thing that removed all other information from the body except itself. She went under and came up, and the creek was shallow here, barely to her waist, but the current pushed at her legs and the bank was ice-slicked, and her coat was already soaked, and August was on the far bank looking at her with wide-eyed distress, and she could not get a grip on the ice to pull herself out. She tried 3 times. The 4th time she got her elbows over the edge and dragged herself up and lay on the frozen ground for a moment that she allowed herself and then got to her feet. August was unreachable. He had moved away from the bank, and she could not recross the creek to get to him. She stood on the north bank of Millhaven Creek in a soaked coat, with the temperature dropping and the visibility near zero and no horse, and 5 miles from the ranch in a direction she was no longer certain of. She started walking south. That was the only thing that made sense. Stay moving, stay south. The cold that had shocked her in the water was now settling in with patience. Her coat was freezing on her body, the wet fabric stiffening, and she could feel her legs losing their urgency below the knee, the sensation there becoming blunted and slow. She kept walking. She was counting her steps because the counting gave her mind something to hold on to. She reached 300 and started over. She reached 300 again. She was on her 2nd cycle of counting when she thought of Gideon. Not dramatically. She didn't call his name, didn't surrender to the image of him. It was just that her mind, sorting through what was real and immediate, landed on him the way you put your hand out to a wall in a dark room. He was there in her thinking as a fixed point. He would find the horse. He would know what the horse alone meant. She told herself these things not to feel better, but because she believed them. And believing something true was different from hoping. Her left leg went wrong somewhere around the 500th step of the 3rd cycle. Not a fall, she caught herself, but a stumble that told her the cold had gotten into the muscle itself, past sensation and into function. She stopped and pressed her hands against her thighs and breathed and told herself to keep going. And she did, for another 100 steps, maybe 200, and then she sat down. She did not mean to sit down. Her legs made the decision before her mind agreed to it. She was on the ground in the snow with the wind above her, and a cold that had stopped being painful and started being something else. Quieter, flatter, like noise lowering in a room. When she heard, at some distance she couldn't estimate, a voice, not calling her name. Calling in general, a sound that carried against the wind by being lower than the wind, more deliberate. She tried to answer, and what came out of her was not the clear response she intended. Her chest wasn't working right. She tried again, louder, put everything she had left behind it. The voice changed direction. She heard the horse before she saw it, hoofbeats on frozen ground, and then out of the white a shape resolved. A horse and rider coming toward her at a speed that was reckless for the conditions, which told her everything she needed to know about the rider's state of mind. Gideon came off August. Her horse, he had found her horse, before the animal fully stopped and crossed the ground between them in 4 strides. And he was down on one knee beside her, and his hands were on her face, and he was saying her name, not loudly, in that same low register he used with injured animals. And she understood she was being assessed the way he assessed things, completely, immediately, without panic. "I'm cold," she said, which was the most inadequate sentence she had ever constructed. "I know." He was already pulling her upright. "Can you stand?" "I don't think my legs." "I've got you." He got her up. He kept her up. He walked her to the horse and lifted her onto the saddle and swung up behind her and wrapped his coat around them both. That worn canvas coat with the torn elbow, the one she had catalogued with such swift judgment on a platform 3 months ago. And it smelled like him, like cold air and hay and wood smoke, and it was the warmest thing she had felt since the creek. He turned the horse south and rode with one arm around her, and she felt his heartbeat against her back, faster than usual, and knew that the steadiness she heard in his voice had cost him something to maintain. "I found the fence," she said into the wind. He said nothing for a moment. "It's down," she said. "Northeast corner, about 30 feet. The posts are solid." "Evelyn?" His voice was low and complicated in a way she hadn't heard before. "I know," she said. "I know." She felt him press his face briefly against the back of her head, just for a second. Then he looked up and watched the terrain and rode them home through the dark and snow, and neither of them said anything else until the ranch lights appeared through the white, like something she had not been entirely certain she would see again. Pete had the barn door open. He looked at them with an expression so raw with relief that she felt bad for causing it. Gideon got her inside the house with an efficiency that brooked no argument, and he put her in front of the stove and dealt with her frozen coat with the same hands-on practicality he brought to everything and wrapped her in every blanket within reach. And he made her drink something hot that was terrible, and she drank it anyway. He knelt in front of her and held her hands between his and rubbed them slowly and steadily, not looking at her face, looking at her hands. "Say something," she said, because the silence had weight in it. "Not yet," he said. She watched his face. The jaw was tight, the crease between his brows deeper than usual. "I was trying to help," she said. "I know that." "The weather changed faster than Evelyn." He looked up. "I know why you went. I know exactly why you went." His voice was steady, but something underneath it was not. "But if Pete hadn't told me which direction, if August hadn't come back on his own—" He stopped, looked back at her hands. 5 more minutes out there." "I know," she said quietly. He didn't say anything else. He kept holding her hands and rubbing the warmth back into them, and she could feel the feeling returning, pins and needles, aching, real. And she thought that this was what he had instead of speeches. He just stayed and worked and kept doing the necessary thing until the crisis passed. Outside, the storm settled over the ranch like it intended to stay a while. Inside, the fire in the stove ticked and breathed, and Gideon Hale held his wife's cold hands in the dark and brought her back, degree by degree, from the edge of something neither of them would speak about directly for a long time. She was going to be all right. She knew at the moment feeling came back into her fingers, and the pain of it made her gasp, and he said, "Good." Just that, just the one word. Like the pain was the point, like the pain meant she was still there, and that was the only thing that mattered. She was in bed for 3 days, not because Gideon insisted, though he did, quietly, without negotiation, in the tone he used when a thing was decided and discussion was a formality he was willing to skip. She stayed because her body made the argument more convincingly than he could. The cold had gone deeper than she understood in the field, and when the warmth came back it brought with it a fever that arrived the second night and stayed through the 3rd day, burning off whatever reserves she had left from the creek and the walk and the hours on the horse going home. She was not a good patient. She was aware of this and could not entirely correct it. She kept trying to sit up to ask about the ledger, about the cattle numbers, about whether Gideon had gotten out to repair the northeast fence, and each time she sat up the room made a slow rotation that talked her back down. Gideon came in every 2 hours. Not hovering, he was not a hoverer. It wasn't in his nature to stand at a bedside wringing his hands, but checking. The way he checked everything on the ranch, systematically, without drama, making sure the situation hadn't changed in ways that required action. He brought soup the first day that was considerably better than the stew from her first night, and she told him so, and he said he'd had practice. "Since I arrived?" she asked. "Since Doyle got sick 3 winters ago," he said. "He was down for a week. I learned fast that a man who eats badly when he's well eats worse when he's ill, and it becomes a problem." She looked at the soup. "You made this better because of Doyle." "I made it better because a sick person needs to eat, and bad soup doesn't accomplish that." He picked up the empty cup from her nightstand. "Finish the bowl." "I'm not hungry." "That's not relevant," he said, and left. She finished the bowl. On the second night, the fever was highest, and she drifted in and out of sleep with the particular consciousness of illness. Half present, thoughts arriving sideways, unable to maintain a clear line between what was remembered and what was dreamed. At some point, she became aware that he was in the chair by the window, not sleeping, just sitting, one leg crossed over the other, looking at the middle distance in the dark. "You don't have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at his silhouette against the window. The wind outside had dropped after the storm, and the night was that specific frontier quiet, absolute, like sound itself had frozen. "Gideon?" "Go back to sleep, Evelyn. I need to say something first." A pause. "It'll wait until morning." "I don't want to wait until morning." She pushed herself up slightly against the pillow. Her head ached and her chest was tight, and she felt scraped out in a way that was honest, the way illness stripped everything down to what was actually there. "I made a decision out there that I didn't fully think through. You told me not to go, and you were right, and I went anyway, and I need you to know that I understand that." He was quiet for a moment. "You've already apologized," he said. "I apologized for the outcome," she said. "I'm apologizing for the reasoning. I went because I wanted to prove something. Not to you, to myself. That I was capable of that kind of work, that kind of risk. That I belonged out here in all the ways that matter, not just the ones that happen indoors." She paused. "That's not a good enough reason to take that kind of risk." The chair creaked slightly as he shifted his weight. "No," he said. "It's not." He said it plainly, without cruelty. "But I understand it." "Do you?" "You've spent your whole life being capable," he said slowly, "in rooms where capability was tolerated but not required. Not in any real way. You got here, and suddenly capable meant something with actual weight to it. And I think you wanted to feel that, all of it, including the parts that were hard." She lay in the dark processing that. "That's very accurate," she said finally. "I've been thinking about it for 2 days," he said, "while I was sick." "While you were sick." She was quiet for a moment. "What were you thinking exactly, when you found me?" He didn't answer immediately. She heard him breathe. "I wasn't thinking," he said. "That's the truth of it. From the moment August came back without you until I found you on that ground, I wasn't thinking at all. I was just moving." A pause. "I've lost animals out there. I've had close calls myself. I know what this land costs when it decides to collect. But finding you on the ground like that..." He stopped. "Gideon, I'm not built for that particular kind of fear," he said. "I want you to know that. I don't scare easy, but that scared me." She had never heard him say anything like that before, not close to it. He was a man who stated feelings the way he stated facts, plainly, without performance. But he was sparing with the ones that revealed something underneath the competence. This was underneath the competence. "I'm sorry," she said. "Truly. I know you are." Another pause. "Go to sleep." She did. And when she surfaced briefly in the deep middle of the night, he was still in the chair. By the 4th day, she was well enough to come downstairs, and she did so over his stated reservation, which she acknowledged and moved past, and sat at the kitchen table with her ledger and her tea, and felt the satisfaction of returning to upright life. He looked at her from across the kitchen with an expression that had a whole conversation in it that neither of them opened, and then he went out to check the cattle, and that was that. The fence, she learned, had been repaired the morning after the storm. Gideon and Doyle had ridden out as soon as the weather broke. All 30 feet of it, new wire, 2 replaced posts. She noted it in the maintenance log she'd started keeping alongside the financial ledger, because she had come to understand that on a working ranch, everything was connected to everything else, and the only way to see the whole picture was to track all of it. What changed after the creek was harder to name than anything she could put in a ledger. It wasn't dramatic. Gideon was not the kind of man who marked transformations with declarations, and she was not the kind of woman who needed them. But something in the architecture of how they moved around each other shifted in the weeks after February, some load-bearing adjustment that changed the shape of the rooms they shared without altering any of the rooms themselves. He started asking her to ride with him in March, when the thaw was still tentative and the ground unpredictable, but the worst of the danger was past. Short rides at first, practical ones, to check the south pasture fence to assess the creek levels. He showed her things in the field the way he'd shown her things from the wagon road in December, except that now she was alongside him instead of beside him as a stranger, and the difference was considerable. He corrected her when she misread terrain signs. She corrected him twice about what she'd read in the geology survey about the creek drainage. And both times he considered what she said and adjusted his assessment, which she noted and did not comment on but felt. He also, in March, told her about his first winter. He told it the way he told most things, without staging, just as a thing that had happened. He'd been 20 years old, his uncle 2 months gone back to Ohio, alone on 160 acres of raw land with 40 head of cattle and a barn that needed work before the cold hit and not enough time to finish it. He'd lost 11 head that winter, 11 out of 40, more than a quarter of his entire operation, because he'd misjudged how fast the temperatures would drop and hadn't finished the shelter modifications in time. 11, she said. 11. Kept his eyes on the pasture they were crossing. I sat in that barn in January and I looked at what was left and I tried to calculate whether I could survive it. Not physically, financially. Whether the operation could absorb that loss and still exist come spring. And could it? Barely. He glanced at her. I sold my uncle's watch. It was silver, good quality. I sold it to a man in Harlan for enough to cover the feed I needed through March. She rode beside him in silence for a moment. Did you ever tell your uncle? Not the watch part. A beat. He would have sent money. I didn't want money. I wanted to see if I could do it myself. She understood that. She understood it in her own body, in the specific way you understand things that live in you as well as in another person. I came here because I wanted to do something myself, she said. Not with my father, not for my father. Something that was mine. Is it? He asked. Genuine question. She looked at the land around her, the brown winter pasture beginning its slow turn, the sky enormous and pale blue and honest above them. She looked at the fence line they'd just come from, solid and repaired. She thought about the ledger on the desk inside, the numbers in it building month by month into something that told a real story about a real place. Yes, she said. It is. He nodded once, and they rode back to the ranch in the easy silence that had long since stopped feeling empty. April brought the first real warmth, and with it the full chaos of a working ranch coming out of winter. The cattle needed moving, fences needed comprehensive inspection. The spring planting of the kitchen garden that Evelyn had added to her responsibilities required attention, and a new calf had been born with complications that meant Gideon spent 2 nights in the barn while she kept coffee going and documented the situation in the ranch log with more anxiety than she showed. The calf survived. She noted this in the log and felt disproportionately pleased about it. What she did not expect was the evening in late April when Gideon came in from the barn later than usual, cleaned up at the basin, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at her with the expression that she had catalogued but never quite solved, and said, I want to tell you something. She set down her pen. All right. When you got off the train, he said, in December. She waited. I saw your face, he said. When you looked at me on that platform, I saw exactly what you thought. She kept her voice steady. I know. I've apologized for that. I'm not raising it as a complaint. He put his hands flat on the table. I'm raising it because I want to tell you what I did with it. She looked at him. I decided to wait, he said. That's all. I decided that what you saw wasn't wrong. I do look exactly like what I looked like on that platform, and I always will, and nothing about that is going to change. But I thought that if I just continued to be what I actually am, without trying to persuade you of it, without performing anything, then either you'd come to see it, or you wouldn't. He paused. I've been called patient my whole life. My uncle said it was my best quality. I always thought it wasn't really patience. It's more that I trust time to do what argument can't. Evelyn sat across from him and felt something move through her that didn't have a clean name. The woman who left, she said carefully, the one who came to see the ranch before. His expression didn't change much. A slight tightening. Clara. Did you wait for her? I tried, he said, but she had made up her mind before she arrived, and there was nothing for time to work on. The decision was already finished. He looked at his hands on the table. With you, it was different. I could see you were working on it, that you were genuinely trying to reconcile what you saw with what you knew. From the letters. From the letters, he confirmed. She thought about this first weeks, the box, the bookshelves, The kitchen window at dawn, watching him split wood. The evening with the hawk. The way he handed the finances to her without ceremony. All of it assembling over months into the portrait that the letters had promised, but that she'd been unable to see on a platform in December because she had looked with her eyes and not with the 8 months of conversation she was carrying. "I was awful," she said. "Not outwardly. I tried to be civil, but inside for those first days—" "I know," he said. "I watched you fight it." "Was it—" She stopped, started again. "Was it painful? Knowing?" He considered the question with the seriousness he gave to things that deserved it. "Lonely," he said finally. "Not painful. I was used to my own company, but I'd been looking forward to not being alone, and then to be there, with you, and feel you still deciding whether I was worth your time." He paused. "That was lonely." She felt the word in her chest like a stone dropped in water, the rings of it spreading outward. "I'm sorry," she said. It was the third time she had apologized to this man, and the most complete of the three. "I'm genuinely sorry. You deserve better from me from the beginning. You gave me what you had," he said. "Given what you were walking into, it was reasonable." "It wasn't, though. I knew enough from your letters to have been—" "Evelyn?" His voice was gentle. "You could have known a man through 1,000 letters and still needed to see him in person to truly know him. That's not a failure. That's just how people work." She looked at him across the table. This man with his weathered face and his rough hands and his cracked-spined Shakespeare and his patient gray-green eyes that missed nothing. "You are," she said slowly, "genuinely unlike anyone I have ever known." Something crossed his face, not the almost smile this time, but the real one, which she had seen rarely enough that she had not yet taken it for granted. "Is that good?" he said. "I asked you that question in December," she said. "You answered it." He remembered. She could see that he remembered. "Good or bad, you said," he said. "And you said you genuinely didn't know yet." "I know now," she said. He waited. "It's good," she said. "It's very good." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked down at the table, and something in the line of his shoulders shifted, some held thing releasing. And she understood that the patience had cost him more than he'd ever said, that the waiting had required something from him that wasn't effortless just because he made it look that way, and that this moment, this ordinary moment at a kitchen table in April with the sound of cattle in the near pasture and the last of the winter cold finally giving up on the window glass, was a thing he had hoped for without knowing if he'd get it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked at it. Then he turned his hand over and held hers, and did not make any more of it than that, because that was who he was. And she had come to understand that who he was and what he showed were the same thing, always, without gap or performance or hidden room. The kitchen was warm. The ranch was quiet. Outside, the Wyoming spring was arriving at its own pace, indifferent and real, and altogether beautiful in the way that honest things are beautiful. Not because they perform beauty, but because they simply are what they are, and what they are is enough. She did not know yet what the years would look like. She did not know about the drought in 3 years that would test everything they had built, or the expansion that would follow it, or the children who would come and fill the house with noise she had not anticipated and could not imagine life without. She did not know about any of that. What she knew was this hand holding hers, and the table between them, and the window going gold with the last of the April light, and the specific feeling of being somewhere that had become, without her quite noting the moment it happened, home. The drought came in the summer of the 3rd year, the way real trouble usually comes. Not announced, not dramatic, just quietly present one morning when Gideon walked the south pasture and looked at the grass and came back to the house with a particular set to his jaw that Evelyn had learned to read the way she read the ledger columns. Something was off. Something needed accounting for. "How bad?" she asked, when he sat down at the kitchen table without pouring coffee first, which was how she knew it was serious. "Bad enough," he said. "The creek's down by half. Grass in the east pasture is burning off faster than I've seen in 3 years. If we don't get significant rain by August, we're going to have a feed problem." She pulled the ledger toward her without being asked. She had the winter feed costs, the projected summer grazing numbers, the cattle count. 280 head now, down from their high of 340 after she'd convinced Gideon 2 years ago to sell a specific cut of the herd at peak market rather than holding through winter. He had listened. They had made more on that sale than the ranch had ever made on cattle in a single month. "If we reduce the herd now," she said, working through it as she spoke, "before the market realizes how widespread this drought is, we sell at current prices. If we wait and everyone sells at once, price drops," he said. Significantly. She ran the numbers. "We sell 60 head this week. We cover our feed costs through October, even in a worst-case scenario, and we don't lose any profit margin." He looked at the numbers over her shoulder. She felt him thinking, not the quick calculation of someone being told what to do, but the slower process of a man checking the numbers against everything he knew about the land and the animals and the market, running the two systems in parallel. 60, he said. 60 to start. If the rain comes in August, we stop there. If it doesn't, we decide again. Doyle won't like it. Doyle doesn't do the books. Gideon almost smiled. No, he said. He doesn't. They sold 63 head that week. Gideon found 3 additional animals that weren't thriving and added them to the cut without her suggesting it, because he still knew things about this herd that no ledger captured and never would. The sale price was good. 4 weeks later, when the drought bit down hard across the county and every rancher in the territory was flooding the market at once, the price dropped by nearly a third. Gideon sat with the newspaper from Harlan that reported the regional cattle prices and read it in silence. "You saw it coming," he said. "We saw it coming," she said. "Your read on the grass in the creek is what told me the timeline." He folded the newspaper. "There are 3 ranches east of us that are going to have a hard winter." "I know." He looked at her. "Calloway's place. He's got 2 young kids." She looked back at him. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we have surplus feed capacity now, with the reduced herd." He said it carefully, like he was working out whether the idea was sound as he spoke it. "If we offered Calloway a winter feed arrangement, he pays us back in labor come spring, or in kind if he can manage it. That's not a business arrangement," she said. "That's a loan we might not recover." "I know what it is." She held his gaze, thought about the man she had arrived to find on a platform with mud on his boots and a torn coat, who had sold his uncle's silver watch to cover feed costs in his first bad winter rather than ask for help from the one person who would have given it. "Draw up the terms," she said. "Make them reasonable. He keeps his dignity and we keep it honest." Calloway accepted. He worked the Hale Ranch for 6 weeks the following spring and proved, as Gideon had suspected, to be a man worth helping. Capable, reliable, grateful in the way that people are grateful when they're not humiliated by the receiving of it. The arrangement was never spoken about widely, which was how Gideon wanted it, but 2 other ranching families in the county knew about it anyway, because things like that travel even when no one talks, and it changed something about the Hale name in the region that would matter in ways they couldn't fully measure. The children arrived over the following years in their own time and on their own terms, which Evelyn felt was appropriate given their parentage. Margaret came first, in the 4th year, named for Evelyn's cousin, who had kept her promise about letters longer than expected, and who wept when she was told about the name in a letter that Evelyn imagined arriving on a Tuesday to a Philadelphia house that felt very far away. Margaret was born with her father's eyes and her mother's mouth, and a disposition that combined the stubbornness of both in concentrations that neither parent had anticipated. Thomas arrived 2 years after that. He was a quieter child than his sister, observant, careful, slow to speak, but precise when he did, which made Gideon look at him sometimes with the particular expression of a man recognizing himself in a smaller version. And Ruth, 3 years after Thomas, who arrived with Margaret's energy and Thomas's precision, and some third quality entirely her own, that Evelyn could only describe as the specific confidence of someone who arrives already knowing what they want from the world. The house that had been too quiet in December of that first year became something else entirely. It became loud and complicated and occasionally overwhelming, and always underneath all of that, full in a way that Evelyn had not known she was missing until she stopped being able to imagine it empty. Gideon was not a natural at fatherhood in the way that some men appeared to be. Effortless, performatively warm, the kind of father who seemed to have been born ready for small children attached to his legs. He was good at it in the way he was good at most things, through attention and patience and the willingness to learn what each child specifically needed without assuming they were all the same. He taught Margaret to ride at 5 and spent 3 more years being corrected by her about horse behavior she'd observed independently and was not shy about reporting. He spent long evenings with Thomas explaining the land the same way he had explained it to Evelyn from the wagon road, and watched the boy absorb it with an appetite that was uncannily familiar. With Ruth, he was, uncharacteristically, somewhat outmaneuvered. She was the one child who had figured out early that her father's patience was a quality she could use, and she used it with an effectiveness that made Evelyn admire and despair in equal measure. "She's going to be trouble," Doyle said once, watching Ruth negotiate a later bedtime with an argument so structured it had premises and a conclusion. "She's going to be something," Evelyn agreed. The ranch grew not through luck or inheritance, but through the accumulated decisions of two people who turned out to think well together. Evelyn expanded the financial arrangements: a formal contract with the neighboring property for shared equipment costs, a timber agreement that brought in winter revenue without depleting the stands, a relationship with a cattle buyer in Cheyenne that cut out the middlemen who had been taking margin for years. Gideon expanded the land use. A section of the North Range he'd been leaving fallow turned out, with the management Evelyn had researched and he had implemented, to support a rotation system that improved the grass quality measurably over 3 seasons. They argued, that is the truth that gets left out of stories about good marriages, or it gets softened into something charming. A playful disagreement, a difference of opinion that resolves sweetly. Their arguments were not charming. They were genuine conflicts between two people who both thought clearly, and neither of whom was inclined to abandon a position without cause. The drought year's fence dispute, which had ended with Evelyn in a frozen creek, was the most dramatic but not the only one. There was a disagreement in the 6th year about whether to take on a second full-time hand that lasted 3 weeks and produced a specific atmosphere in the kitchen that the children learned to navigate around. There was an argument about a business arrangement with a man named Garrett, who Evelyn's numbers said was overextended and Gideon's instincts said was trustworthy, and they were both partially right, which was somehow more frustrating than if one of them had been simply wrong. What they didn't do was let the arguments harden into something permanent. Evelyn had grown up watching her father's marriage, a slow, quiet war conducted entirely in silences and loaded sentences, no one ever saying the real thing, the resentment building in layers like sediment until it was geological. She had not understood growing up that there was an alternative. She understood it now. "You're still wrong about Garrett," she told Gideon 2 years after the fact, sitting on the porch on a summer evening watching the light go off the hills. "I know," he said. "You've made that clear on 4 separate occasions." "I'm making it clear again." "I noticed." She looked at him. "You could concede more gracefully." "I could," he agreed, "but then you'd lose the pleasure of making the point." She was quiet for a moment, then, "That's very calculating of you. I've been married to a numbers woman for 8 years. It rubs off." She laughed. It was not a delicate laugh. It never had been, and she didn't bother making it one. Years accumulate differently than you expect them to. They do not arrive in a line, each distinct and countable. They layer, they compress, they blur at the edges. And what you find when you look back is not a sequence but a texture, the quality of a life lived in a particular place with a particular person, the specific weight and color of it. Doyle left in the 12th year to start his own small operation 20 miles west, which Evelyn had seen coming before Gideon had, and which Gideon had half known and not wanted to name. They hired a man named Cass, who was older than Doyle and more experienced and talked less and worked harder, which was a combination they had come to value. Pete stayed. Pete was somehow still there in his 20s, still occasionally uncertain about what was happening, but deeply loyal and quietly competent in a way that had crept up on everyone. Margaret left first, which was inevitable. She was 19 and she went east, Philadelphia, of all places, to study at a women's college that had opened in the city, and she did it with the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told that her choices were constrained by her gender, because they hadn't been. Because she had grown up watching a mother who ran the finances of a cattle operation and a father who taught her that intelligence had no particular residence. She wrote long letters. Evelyn read them standing at the kitchen window, the same window where she had stood in her first weeks in this house, learning its light and its view. The letters were full of opinions and observations, and some frustration and occasional wonder, and they sounded exactly like their author, which made Evelyn simultaneously proud and homesick for a person who was still alive and flourishing. Thomas stayed. He came back after 2 years away learning practical engineering from a firm in Denver, And he came back with new knowledge and old roots and the specific steadiness of a man who had gone somewhere else and confirmed that here was where he belonged. He took over more of the land management from Gideon incrementally, not with any ceremony, just organically, the way authority passes in a working family. The younger generation simply begins handling things, and the older generation begins letting them. Ruth went west, which surprised no one who knew her. California, then eventually Oregon, a life that was her own construction entirely. She came back to visit with the unpredictability of a comet, infrequently, fully, blazing through the house for 2 weeks every year or two, and leaving it noisier and more thoroughly disrupted than she found it. Gideon was 61 when the first sign appeared. It was small. He lost his footing on a perfectly good piece of ground in the east pasture and caught himself, which would not have been remarkable except that Evelyn had been watching from the fence and she saw his expression afterward. Not embarrassment, but something more inward, a man registering a data point he didn't yet want to interpret. She didn't say anything that day. She said something a month later when she noticed his handwriting in the ranch log was larger than it had been, the letters less precisely formed. He looked at what she was showing him for a long moment and said nothing. "I want you to see a doctor," she said. "I've been thinking the same thing," he said. He said it so simply that it hit her harder than a denial would have, because it meant he had been sitting with something private, working on it in the way he worked on everything, alone first, until he was ready. And the fact that he said it out loud meant he had been carrying it long enough that it needed sharing. The doctor in Cheyenne gave them the information plainly, which Gideon had asked him to do and which Evelyn was grateful for, even though gratitude was not exactly what she felt. A progressive condition, manageable for now. The timeline uncertain, as these things are. They drove back from Cheyenne mostly in silence, the way they had driven many things in silence over the years, except that this silence had a different weight than any of the others. She sat beside him and watched Wyoming come at them through the windshield and thought about a wagon road in December, a hawk circling above a far ridge, a man who talked about geology and elk antlers, and the Arapaho woman who knew what grew in this valley and what it did. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. "About the land," she said. "Something I don't know yet." He was quiet for a moment, and then, in the voice she had first heard on a frozen wagon road in the territory that had become her life, he began to talk. He talked about the geology of the hills south of the ranch, a formation she had read about in the survey book he had given her that first Christmas, but that was different when he described it. More real, more immediate, more alive. He talked about a particular spring that appeared only in heavy snowmelt years, fed by an underground source that he had spent 15 years trying to map and never fully solved. He talked about a prairie dog colony on the East Range that had been there since before he arrived and had outlasted 3 drought years and 2 floods, and apparently had no intention of going anywhere. She listened. She always listened when he talked about the land. She thought she probably always would. Gideon lived 8 more years. They were not easy years in the way that the early years had not been easy, but they were full. Thomas ran more of the ranch and ran it well. Margaret came back for longer visits as the situation became clearer, and she and her father spent long evenings on the porch with a chessboard between them, arguing about the games and other things with a specific quality of equality that Evelyn watched from the kitchen window sometimes and felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Something that was not quite happiness, because it was too complex for that, but was somewhere in that region. Ruth came back in this final year and stayed. She arrived with her characteristic certainty and the specific practical love of someone who knows that presence is the only thing that matters at certain junctures, and she cooked badly and fixed things around the house with startling competence and sat with her father in the evenings reading. The two of them quiet together in a way that reminded Evelyn, every single time she saw it, of winter evenings years ago when she had looked up from her book and found him watching her. He died in March, which he would not have chosen, but which Evelyn later thought was appropriate for a man who had always had the quality of something that persisted through winter, the particular stubbornness of things that are still there when the thaw comes. He was in his own bed, in his own house, which was what he had asked for and what he got. She sat with him for a long time after. She was not the kind of woman who dissolved. She never had been. She sat and she held his hand, which was still rough and dry, the way it had always been, the way it was when he held hers on that kitchen table in April more than 30 years ago, and she thought about all of it. Not in sequence, not in order, but the way you think about a life when you're holding it in full, all at once, in texture and weight, in smell and sound, and the specific quality of light in particular moments. She thought about this platform. She always came back to the platform. The coat was in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. She had not repaired the torn elbow. She had thought about it many times over the years, had in fact picked up a needle and thread more than once, and each time she had put them down again because the tear was part of the coat now, and the coat was part of what she needed to remember. Margaret drove from the east for the burial. Thomas was there, had been there for the last weeks. Ruth was already there. They buried him on the ranch, on the rise above the south pasture, where the view extended north to the tree line and east to where Millhaven Creek ran in its channel, and where in spring, if you stood still and knew where to look, you could see ferruginous hawks circling the thermals above the far ridge. Evelyn stood at that grave for a while after the others had moved away, and she talked to him in her head, not to his spirit or to any afterlife, because she was a practical woman and Gideon had been a practical man, but to him as she held him in her memory, which was the only place anyone ever really lives once they're gone. She told him about the numbers. The ranch was sound. Thomas had the south expansion well in hand. The accounts were clean and projected positive for the next 3 years at minimum. She told him this the way she had always told him things, directly, without decoration, because he had never required decoration, and she had stopped providing it 32 years ago on a wagon road in December. She told him she was not looking for an exit, had not been, she said, for a very long time. In the years that followed, Evelyn ran the ranch's finances with the same clarity she had always brought to them, transitioning authority to Thomas gradually, with the same lack of ceremony with which Gideon had once handed her a nail crate full of papers and trusted her to make sense of it. She taught Margaret's eldest daughter bookkeeping on visits east, because the girl had her grandmother's eyes for pattern, and it seemed wrong not to cultivate it. She wrote to Ruth every month without fail. She kept the coat. She had thought, after Gideon died, that keeping it would be painful. What she found instead was that it was clarifying. She would take it out sometimes, not often, but sometimes, and hold the worn canvas in her hands and look at the torn elbow and think about all the things you cannot see about a person from 10 feet away on a frozen platform in December. All the things that require time and proximity and the willingness to revise what you decided you knew. She had a conversation once in her later years with a young woman in Harlan who had come west to marry a man she knew through letters and was frightened of what she might find when she arrived. Someone had told the woman that Evelyn Hale was a person worth talking to on the subject. Evelyn sat across from the woman in the small hotel dining room in Harlan and looked at her. This young woman, her hands wound together in her lap, her face full of the specific anxiety of someone standing at the edge of an irrevocable choice, and thought about what to say. She thought about the platform. She thought about the voice that had spoken in her chest on that frozen December afternoon. This was a mistake. She thought about what it would have cost her to listen to it. Look at his letters, she said. Not the words. The words are just words. Look at what he paid attention to. Look at what he thought was worth telling you. Look at what questions he asked. She paused. A man who asks good questions is showing you something real about him, more real than his face. The woman listened. And when you get off that train, Evelyn said, whatever you see, whatever your first thought is, give it a week before you trust it. Not because your instincts are wrong, but because the best things don't always look like themselves from the outside. Sometimes they need time and light and a little patience before you can see what they actually are. She drove back to the ranch in the afternoon light, the hills going amber around her, the land she had come to know, the way you know something you have chosen and been chosen by. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but truly, completely. Without the gap between the surface and the inside that makes so many things feel hollow after a while. She had crossed a platform 30-some years ago and made a judgment in 30 seconds that was wrong in nearly every way that mattered. Everything she had, the ranch, the children, the 32 years of a life built with someone who was exactly who he said he was, every letter, every time, had come from being willing to revise that judgment. From staying when the easy thing was to go. From opening the box instead of closing the door. The coat hung on the peg in the bedroom. The torn elbow faced the window. She left it there because that is where it belonged. Visible, imperfect, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know the story, and to anyone who did, the whole story at once. A woman who had arrived on a train in December with her judgment already made, and a man who had decided to wait. And 32 years of what patience and honesty and the willingness to be wrong can build, if you let them. That is the whole of it. That is enough.